Cover more of these next week. All right, welcome to our class number 8 of our CSE 201. We left off last week talking about the Lost Squadron. I forgot to mention in their last week's lesson that we have a model of the Lost Squadron right in the next room here. You can see the little airplane down there and how far they had to drill to get to it. Those layers are not different ages. That's one of the lies in the textbooks. Also, they tell the kids that the layers of rock that we see in the world, the so-called geologic column, represents different time frames, and that is simply baloney. I was taught this. I believed it as a kid. I thought, well, it's in the textbooks. It's got to be true, you know. The whole geologic column is a joke. All over the world, petrified trees are found standing up, connecting these rock layers. Why on earth would we teach the kids the layers are different ages? I mean, how long does a dead tree stand up before it falls over? Is it possible for the bottom half to petrify and the top to keep growing? I mean, think about it. There's just no possible way this can happen. We had a German TV crew here today videotaping an interview with me, and I showed them this about the geologic column. They were just like calf looking at a new gate, like, everybody believes that. Yeah, you're probably right. Not everybody, but a lot of people believe it because that's what they've been taught. But it's not correct. Joggins, Nova Scotia, a friend of mine called me there from there today. He's up there getting some of the petrified wood. He's going to try to get a petrified tree in the vertical position, get a video footage of it, and then get it removed and bring it down here for our museum. That'd be cool, have one of those. We've got a petrified tree right here that broken up into logs. You want a petrified tree, if it ever does get free from the dirt, it'll fall over, and it's solid rock. You know, it's going to bust up into logs. You go to the petrified desert in forest in Arizona, or Calistoga, California, or Florida, Mississippi. There are petrified forests all over America. You see oftentimes great big trees up into logs. They're probably petrified standing up. In Cookeville, Tennessee, a friend of mine was just up there south of Cookeville, about 30 miles, where these trees are, in a mine of coal commercially, so people go after it just to heat their homes. They go dig out some coal and heat their homes for the winter with it, just a small, thin layer of coal. But the tree is coalified, the center is petrified, and the top is coalified again. It runs through two different coal. School are going to tell the kids, a forest has to grow, which is going to take hundreds of years, and then it gets compacted and slowly turns to coal, which has never been seen, by the way. Never seen coal in the process of forming like that in nature. And then they'll say, you know, 30, 40 feet of mud had to walk, will take another few 100,000 years, and then a whole new forest has to grow to get the layer of coal. In Yellowstone National Park, there are 27 consecutive layers of petrified trees. And the evolutionists will argue each of the trees in those Yellowstone and Specimen Ridge, I've been there, is about 500 years old. You know, big times 27, that's way more time than your Bible allows for. Well, you're assuming each layer had to form separately. What if there was a log mat drifting back and forth over that area as the tide went back and forth and dropped off 27 layers in 2 days? You know, it doesn't take millions a year. Logs down into Spirit Lake. It nearly covered the lake. There were 3 square miles, nearly 2,000 acres of lake covered with wood. You could walk across the water on top of the wood. 2,000 acres of floating logs. They began to get waterlogged, of course, soaked full of water, and then they began to flip up and float upright. Nearly always it was the root end down because the root end is heavier on the tree. And it was interesting, they began to sink to the bottom by species. The Douglas fir would all sink at the same time, within the same year, because they're similar density. Then the spruce would sink a different time. And so they're buried at the bottom of Spirit Lake. Over 20,000 trees are down there right now, stuck in the mud at the bottom of the lake. None of them grew there. None of them. Okay? They all got blown in by the volcano, floated in upright position, stuck to the bottom, and they're being buried in layer after layer after layer of sediments. Already 15 feet deep in sediments, and it's only been 20 years since the volcano erupted. That's just normal. Every time it rains, it washes dirt in off the side of the mountain, and it's just normal to get new sediments at the bottom of a lake every year. Those trees are going to petrify standing up. Now, during Noah's flood, you would get this on a worldwide scale. We cover more on that on video 6, but it does not take long. This is a piece of firewood that has quite obviously been chopped on, and it's petrified. We've got in the room right next door here a piece of a petrified pallet. I was preaching in western Tennessee, Union City, I believe is the name of this town. And the guy came to the meeting and he said, Mr. Hovind, how long does it take for... I said, well, I know wood can be petrified in the laboratory in 24 hours. Put it in high mineral content, heat it up, and pressurize it. It'll drive the minerals into the wood fibers and turn to stone in 24 hours. He said, well, I work at a pallet shop where we make pallets for the forklift to pick up, and carry around. He said, we had a mudslide about 30 years ago. Part of the hill slid down, covered up a bunch of the old pallets, new pallets actually. And the boss said, forget it, it's not worth digging them out. We can make a new one for $4 or we can dig it out for $6. Make a new one, okay? So they just left him. Then he said about 25 years later, or 30 years, I forget what the number was, but somewhere around 20 to 30 years later, he said they were digging a trench across there to put in a septic field, and they hit some of the old pallets that had been buried 20 or 30 years earlier, and they had turned to stone. We got a piece of one in the next room in there. Petrified pallet. There's petrified wood in there that's been chopped on. One lady asked me, how long does it take for wood to petrify? I said, oh, it can happen pretty quickly. She said, we had a log pile out in our backyard, and we kept using the logs off the top, and every year we'd cut new lumber and cut new logs and stick it on there, and every year we'd heat our house with wood. And we didn't realize it, but the bottom 2 layers had sunk in, and we kept using off the top of the pile. We don't know how long, probably 20 years. She said those logs in the bottom petrified, turned to stone. There were farmers in Iowa that were told their grandsons to go out and pull up the old fence posts because they wanted to put in new fence posts, and the bottom from the ground down had rotted in just less than 1-2 generations. There's a book in the library called Handy Farm Devices. It's printed in 1909. They had a section in there on how to petrify wood. 1909. They said you mix alum and I forget a couple other things. You mix a solution together, put it in a bucket, set your posts in there as deep as you're going to bury them, and let them sit for a few days, and these minerals will soak into the wood and turn it to stone. And then you go put your posts in. You can still nail your fence to the top because it's wood, but it won't rot on the bottom because it's petrified. Farmers have known for a long time how to do that kind of thing. Here's a petrified fish giving birth. It does not take millions of years to give birth. I mean, this obviously is a very rapid event. Okay? Here's a petrified cowboy boot with the cowboy's leg still in it. Right next door, in the next room right out there, you can see the petrified pickle. Have you seen that one, Robert? Petrified pickle? I think, Nathan, I think I unscrewed the screw at the top and just put it in barely. Can you bring that in, the pickle in the jar? You know which one it is, don't you? Yes, sir. Go in the room and just, the screw's just barely in the top, so you should be able to get that open. A guy called me from Montana, 3 years ago, I guess, and said, Brother Hovind, I found this old house in Montana. The house had, most of it had fallen down. It was an old homestead. The roof was gone, the walls are laying out. But he said there's part of a pantry was there, and there was a pickle jar. The lid to the jar had rusted off, and the pickle inside turned to stone. Would you like it for your museum? I said, of course. Who in their right mind would not want a petrified pickle for their museum, So he gave it to me. Is he having trouble getting it out of there? He's got it now. Okay. Yeah, bring it out in here, brother. So you can see it now. The jar was intact when I got it, and I set it down, and apparently the pickle being stone in there bumped the bottom and shattered the bottom. So I glued all the pieces back together of the bottom of the glass, but it was intact. The guy who found it contacted the jar, because almost all bell jars like this, thank you, brother, almost all these jars have a number on the bottom, and you can chase down what company made it based on the number. So he chased it down, and they said, oh, that's the style of jar we made from 1930 to 1960. So the pickle, which is turned to stone, had to be put in the jar, after somewhere 1930 to 1960. Who knows when the house rotted and fell apart, but the pickle inside turned to stone. And like I said, the bottom of the jar is busted up only because I did it, okay, accidentally. This one, I think some of the guys may be saying that's a petrified pickle, but actually that's a fern impression that's sitting next to it in there. We have right in there petrified charcoal briquettes, a petrified octopus arm, a replica of one. Things don't take long to petrify. How many got to see the petrified teddy bear? Did you see the petrified teddy bear in there? There's a place in Czechoslovakia. Have you seen that? Place in Czechoslovakia where, actually Czech Republic, it used to be Czechoslovakia, they split it up 2 countries now, but in the Czech Republic there's a waterfall that's real high in minerals. So they hang all kinds of stuff in there. You hang anything there, and within 2 or 3 weeks it's coated with minerals, and it's not really petrified, it's permineralized, it's coated, it's solid rock. I mean, it's rock coating on the outside. If you left it there long enough or soaked it in this stuff, it would turn to solid rock. But the petrified teddy bear's in there, the petrified rose, they hang all kinds of stuff in there and then sell it, you know, souvenirs on a petrified teddy bear. Not very cuddly. But so the point is, it doesn't take long for things to petrify, and the petrified trees in the standing position, I think, are really good evidence for a rapid burial in Noah's flood. Only way I can see, producing all those thousands of layers. The other thing you got to consider in your worldview of how the flood would fit in here. In a flood, you have, if the world was covered with, you have an interesting situation because the earth is still turning and the moon is up there pulling the water up, the tides, okay? What's the tide in California where you're from, brother? How far does it go up and down?
Mean tide is 5 foot 2 feet, like up and down.
5 foot?
Yeah, 2 centimeters, about 3 foot mean.
Okay.
Yeah.
So up and down 2.5 feet?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Low tide to high tide, 5 foot difference. Here in Pensacola, it's only like 18 inches. Up at the Bay of Fundy in Canada, it can get up to, I think it's 60 feet average, and the highest spring tide is 102 feet. The world's record tide, Bay of Fundy. The tide is coming in so fast, you can pay $5 or $10 and get in a rubber raft with a bunch of people and sit in front of it, and it pushes you. It's like 20 miles. Pushes you up the, what's the name of that river? No, I forget the name of the river, but who cares? But anyway, it's pretty cool. It does that a couple times a day. And it erodes away the beach rapidly up there in Bay of Fundy, Nova Scotia, Canada. Well, if the moon affected by the flood down on the earth, the moon doesn't care. So the earth is flooded. Now you got a strange situation because the tide starts to come up and then it bangs into something like, you know, California or, you know, South America. We have continents that stop it. And so it just starts to get going and runs into something it can't get over. And so it kind of takes all the energy out of it. Well, if the earth were covered by water, that wouldn't happen. The tide would go up and down about 200 feet if the earth were covered by water. A 200-foot tidal change, earth. If you get all that water being pulled up, it's got to rush in from the sides to fill in that lump. The water rushing in from the sides is going to be causing stratification at the bottom. It's going to be scouring things and shuffling things around. Plus, just 200 feet of water weighs a lot. It would press down on the sediments underneath, and then when the low tide comes by, it would relieve that pressure. So the sediments at the bottom are being squeezed and relieved, squeezed and relieved. That causes a phenomenon called liquefaction. We'll get into more of that in seminar part 6. But the lifting and separating of the particles causes the denser ones to go to the bottom and the lighter ones to go to the top. There was a guy who did an experiment. All the details are talked about on Walt Brown's website, creationscience.com. But he took a cement mixer and mixed up dead birds, dead fish, dead amphibians, dead reptiles, dead mammals, and sand, rocks, gravel, mud, mixed them all up, and he dumped them into a large aquarium. But before he put them in the aquarium, he put a big hot water bottle in the bottom, hooked to a hose, where he poked 1,000 holes in this hot water bottle, okay? So when he turned the hose on, it's going to fill the aquarium from the bottom, coming out all these little holes. So the water's going to be squirting up like 1,000 little squirt guns in the bottom of the aquarium under all this material mixed up in a cement mixer. When he turned the water on and it filled the aquarium from the bottom, as the water is pushing up, it's going to lift sand grains and rocks and particles, and then it's going to drop them again. But the denser ones are going to drop just a little bit faster than the less dense. By the time the aquarium was full, it had already stratified the whole thing. It was dozens of layers of material, and the fish were at the bottom, amphibians were next, reptiles were next, mammals were last. Now the evolutionists will just use an acronym FARM, F-A-R-M, mnemonic device, FARM. Fish, amphibian, reptile, mammal. They will look at the geologic structure of the earth and say, hey, did you know generally birds are found on top? Yep. And clams are generally found at the bottom. Yep. They'll say, see, don't you understand that proves clams evolve first and birds evolve last? No, there might be a couple of other ways to think about that, you know. Maybe clams are at the bottom because that's where they live, okay? They're going to be the first ones buried. They're already at the bottom when the flood starts. Maybe birds are on top because they're the last ones to drown in a flood. You know, they fly around till they run out of gas. So it doesn't prove they are evolved in that order. They might be sorted based upon their density, based upon their intelligence, based upon their mobility. Clams can't run very fast, you know. They might be sorted based upon their habitat, where they live, you know. One already at the bottom is going to be the first one buried. He lives there, okay? So, and a clam, as far as we can figure out, it's not too bright. When something strange happens in his environment, he doesn't know what's going on. What's he do? Clam up. Let's wait till the danger goes past. Well, if he's clammed up and being covered by thousands of feet of sediment, or even 20 feet of sediment, he's done for. Now he can't open. And he's going to die in the closed position, and that's just the way they're found. You said they found giant ones down in Baja California?
Baja California.
South of Tijuana?
Ensenada.
Okay.
South of Ensenada.
Now the one we got pictures in there, 11-foot oysters found on top of mountains 2 miles above sea level. Closed. Well, first place, oysters, 11 foot, pretty big. What's the biggest ones alive today? Have you ever heard anything over 2 feet? Oysters? You live out on the ocean or spend a lot of time out there?
Oysters maybe 6 inches in diameter.
6, 8 inches, yeah.
Now, over in the Orient, they have these big giant clams.
Right.
I imagine they're about, what, 2 feet big in
Yeah.
diameter.
I've seen shells of them at museums and stuff, 2 and 3 feet, you know, but still, 11 footers? 2 miles above sea level? Well, you know, clams don't climb mountains very well, for one thing. And when they die, they open.
These clams weren't on the beach in Baja. They were up on the cliffs and about 4 miles inland.
Okay, John, the guy that brought us the petrified clams, they're out there in your fossil shop. About how many would you guess you have there?
Probably 500 at least, if not 1,000.
Maybe 500 to 1,000? Yeah, buckets and buckets of them.
He said you could
Get all we want.
get thousands.
Yeah. We're going to start selling them in the bookstore, you know, pretty cheap. This would be a great witnessing tool to show somebody a petrified clam in the closed position. Explain this, please. So if you students want to get one, go see John. Just let them pick one out. Give them one, okay? A couple more evidence. Yes, sir?
I was just saying recently when Ken and I spoke at homeschooling, the ammonite and the clam are both great ways to talk about the flood, because they're both things that are found on mountains. And
Right.
on
Ammonite and the clams. Yeah, they're great witnessing tools. Take them with you. Go on to some more evidences that the earth is not billions of years old. The Mississippi River flows down. They call it the Muddy Mississippi. They have to keep building the higher. The folks in New Orleans, or it wasn't strong enough, right? Why would they build a city in a hole to begin with? Is question number one. Why didn't they leave when they had the opportunity? Is question number two. Why do I have to pay to fix it? Is question number three. And why are they fixing it? You know, why rebuild it in the same spot? You know, build it someplace else. You know, go to Kansas, man. It's above sea level, and there's plenty of open land out there. But so as the rivers flow, they bring sediments with them, mud, and normally you have a flood season. The river spreads out over the whole neighborhood, and it drops off another inch or two of fresh soil, sediment. It's called the floodplain. Well, they decided they don't like to get their house flooded every year, so they build a dike, and that's going to hold all the water in the channel. Now, as the water comes down, as soon as the river slows a little bit, it drops the sediments out. Faster it's moving, the sediments it can hold. It's called suspension. It holds them in suspension. Well, when it slows down, it drops them. That's why when the river turns a corner, you get a sandbar. You know, all the sediments drop out of suspension. Who cares? Well, the Mississippi River is now got channels. It can't flood. So all this mud keeps accumulating or goes out into the delta. It's called the New Orleans Delta. The river, you can see it coming down from the upper left there, goes all the way to the lower right on that long peninsula sticking out there. That thing keeps getting longer and longer as new sediments come out. It's actually growing pretty rapidly. 80,000 tons of mud come down the Mississippi every hour. if you could pick up a gallon of it, let it set, see how much sediment settles out, and then multiply that by how many gallons go past every hour, 80,000 tons of mud every hour. Of course, during flood season it's worse, you know, rainy season, dry season it's less, but it averages out a whole lot of mud. They call it the muddy Mississippi for a good reason. I used to live in Illinois. You guys probably to this cause, right? You get a good flood, part of your yard washes down into the Ohio or Wabash in your case, and then it ends up down in New Orleans. Okay, well, the delta is growing larger. There's nobody arguing about that. The problem is, when they run all the math on this, they drill through this delta all the time looking for oil, okay, because they find stuff trapped under this mud that turns to oil. So they know everywhere out there. That's been real well tested. You calculate how much mud there is in this whole delta out here, divided by how fast it's coming, and it comes out about 80,000 years or 30,000 years worth of mud. Probably the New Orleans Delta actually starts someplace up near Memphis, Tennessee. It's all the rest of it's filled in with mud, way down there to Gulf, even into the Gulf of Mexico. You see down there, under the words Gulf of Mexico, they see the words Mississippi Cone. That's some of the mud from the Mississippi way out there. It is, you know, that's probably 500 miles out from the mouth, from the end of the river. Okay. Well, this mud is coming out at 80,000 tons an hour. The question is, why would it be only 30,000 years old? If the Earth is millions of years old, why isn't there more mud? Or why isn't the whole Gulf of Mexico full of mud by now? Now, this is one of the factors, probably, I'm going to say probably the only factor, that has been used by some people to say, this proves there was an ice age 30,000 years ago. The people who say there are multiple ice ages, say there was one 10,000 years ago and one 30,000 years ago. Wait, how do you know that? Well, we know about the one 10,000 years ago from the Niagara Falls. And we know about the one 30,000 years ago from the Mississippi Delta. There might be a simpler explanation for this, guys, okay? Maybe there's only 30,000 years worth of mud out there because, you know, 6,000 years ago God made everything. 4,400 years ago there was a flood. As the flood water was running off, 70% of that mud's going to wash out there in the first 30 minutes. So today it's coming pretty slow. It's only 80,000 tons an hour. You should have seen the first few weeks, man. It was dropping a whole lot of mud out there. So it's just as logical, and I think more logical to say, most of this delta formed very rapidly. The rest has come, you know, fairly slowly, only 80,000 tons an hour. I preached at a church in Louisiana one time, and a guy said, Brother Hovind, I'm a pastor at a church in Baker, Louisiana. Here's his testimony. He wrote me a letter. He said, recently we did a seminar at Comite Baptist, which one of our young married couples attended. They told you a story of an experience I encountered. While working in an oil field, where we drilled through a tree over 60 feet, almost 14,000 feet below the surface. I can tell you that it was block 487 of the Mississippi River Canyon field, and we were drilling for Chevron Oil Company. I was the on-site manager for a well logging and sampling service, Dan Gunter. Imagine that. They drilled through 14,000 feet, which is 2.5 miles. And then they hit a tree. Now, he was the on-site manager. What they do, as they drill, then bring up sections, they save it. And they number it. And they log the whole thing. They want to know what they're drilling through. Because they know they're looking for certain types of rock. All of a sudden, oh, hey, next one we're going to hit oil. Okay? A certain type of rock. So the oil driller, they've drilled, I don't know how many bazillion holes in the world, you know, looking for this. So they know how to find oil. They drill down and they save, it's called the core sample. As they drill down, they save the stuff coming up and they set it up on the deck of the ship or whatever on shore, and they log everything. They drilled through, but the tree was standing up. He said as they were bringing up pieces, they drilled through the top and somewhere, maybe hit the side of it, I don't know. But they drilled through 60 feet of tree standing up under 14,000 feet of mud. How can you explain such a thing? Well, there was a big flood in the days of Noah, okay? I don't see any way they can get around this. when I was up in Anchorage, Alaska, I Portage Glacier. And I'm up there on the ship, you know, looking at the glacier, watching the pieces fall off, and everybody's clapping and cheering. And I got talking to the guy next to me. I said, "What do you do for a living?" He said, "Oh, I work up in the North Slope of Alaska, up near Barrow." I said, "Oh yeah, what do you do?" He said, "Well, we drill for oil up there." I said, "Well, do you ever see anything unusual when you drill?" He said, "You know, we find the strangest things when we drill." He said a couple years ago, I think he said a couple years ago, we were drilling. We drilled through 1,000 feet of permafrost, permanently frozen ground, never thaws out. And we started hitting wood. And we started saving the pieces like well drillers do, you know, to see what we're drilling through. He said we drilled straight down the top of a tree, 300 feet tall, under 1,000 feet of permafrost. Well, first place, there aren't many trees on this planet that are 300 feet tall. Okay? These trees around here in Pensacola, about 60 feet. Not many trees over 60 feet here in Pensacola. And these are big trees. The tallest tree in the world is in a redwood forest, one of the redwood trees in California. It is, I think it's 340 feet now, something like that. It's called the General Sherman tree. It is the world's record holder. 340 feet, I believe, is something close to that is the world's record. And those redwoods, you know, Robert, are huge, okay? You don't have them around your place, do you? Do you have them, are they south of San Francisco? Just north. Muir Woods is low.
2 hours from San Jose.
From San Jose?
Yeah.
I know we used to go to Muir Woods all the time and all up and down the coast clear up to Oregon, you know, to petrify redwood trees. You've been up there, brother, and got probably 30 of them you can drive through. We didn't take my van through there because you have to take the mirrors off. You know, it's a real tight fit with the van. So we said, "Ah, forget it. We'll just take a picture, you know. Trust me, a car will go through there, okay?" But these trees are huge. Albert, you've never been out there, have you? You got to get to California. Haven't seen snow, haven't been to California. We got to send 3 states, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida.
Yeah.
We'll get you to travel some, Albert. Just hang in there, okay? But the point is, a 300-foot tree is absolutely monstrous. To get one under 1,000 feet of permafrost, now how could you explain such a thing? I think there was a flood. A really, really big flood, okay? Like worldwide flood. This is a picture of the oldest tree in the world. Actually, whether it's the oldest tree or not, nobody knows because the oldest one is purposely not identified. There's a whole grove of trees up in the mountains called the White Mountains, right near the Nevada border, California-Nevada border. Have you been up there to the, these kind of trees?
I haven't seen it, but I've seen the Bristol cone pine.
Yeah, well, these are the bristlecone pine, okay? Now, there's also the Joshua trees up there, the Joshua Tree Memorial, you know, those are pretty old. But these bristlecones are fascinating. It is a gnarled mess. It's a tangled up mess, these bristlecones are. They drill in a real tiny hole, about the size, you know, the pencils where you can adjust the lead, those real thin lead strips in there, the number 0.5 millimeter pencils. They've got a drill bit that drills a hole that small, but it's a pipe. It's a pipe that's that small, 0.5 millimeter outside diameter, I believe. As they drill in, it's caking out, the center part is hollow, and so they drill in a ways and then pull it back, and it snaps off a little core sample, real tiny, okay? Then they drill in some more and pull it. They drill into these trees. They don't want to hurt the tree too bad, okay? And then when they're done, you plug the hole with wax or something, I don't know. But so the tree, it grows really funny. It's a tangled up mess, and it's very difficult to count the rings. But the oldest tree, by the way, we got a piece of bristlecone right in the next room here, okay? This is it right here. I counted the rings. I had to use a magnifying glass to count the rings. It's something you guys might want to do for Dinosaur Adventureland when kids come here. If we get a piece of bristlecone and say, who can guess how old it is? And give them a magnifying. I had to use a magnifying glass and a needle. And I was counting the rings, you know, 1, 2, 3. And I put an ink pen and I marked every 10 rings. So if you look in there, every one of the marks is 10 years. Well, 10 rings, okay? Bristlecones grow really slow. If you look out on the long bench we've got out there, we've got all the log samples, you know, on the bench. The very last one, closest to the tower, is a piece of bristlecone. It has 400 rings, and it's only that big around. 400 years old, about. Very tough to count. But anyway, the oldest tree, they've been able to count the rings, and tree ring dating is not an exact science, okay? Sometimes they grow 2 rings a year. Sometimes, you know, it can vary some. But the textbooks will say, oh yeah, we know the earth is, more than the Bible says because, we've got tree rings dating going back 8,000 years. And you're going to hear this argument if you get into evolution or creation debates with somebody. They're going to say, oh, we've got overlapping tree rings. Like here's an example of overlapping tree rings. And they'll say by taking sample from a live tree and sample from a dead tree and sample from a log cabin or sample from an Indian adobe, something that we know is 400 years old, we can overlap the rings and find matching patterns. And you can see where, it's got close rings and the other, and far distant rings and they overlap the rings based on the ring pattern. And they say using this overlapping tree ring method, we can go back 8,000 years is probably the number you're going to hear. Well, I just don't buy that for a second, okay? You can have two trees growing side by side, and they have different growth patterns. If the one tree is taller than the other one, the big tree gets the sunlight, the little one doesn't get the sunlight. The big one has a different growth pattern than the little one. They're growing side by side. The big one dies. Now the little one gets all the sunlight. Its growth pattern is going to change. You can have two trees growing on opposite sides of the same hill, and they'll grow differently because of the minerals in the ground, the sunlight. Trees on the south side in the northern hemisphere are going to get the sunlight. Trees on the north side of a mountain are not going to get the sunlight. That's why the snow melts last on the north side of the mountain. Okay, it doesn't get the sunlight. You can have trees on opposite sides of the same hill growing differently because of the water. When clouds are moving up a hill, they start to cool off and they drop their moisture. When it comes back down the other side, it is expanding and absorbing moisture. It's called the rain shadow. That's why if you look at the state of Washington, the wind blows off the Pacific, hits the mountains and goes up. Well, it drops all the rain on the Pacific side. And there's a huge forest in western Washington. You get up over the mountains and it's a desert. Because the wind, as it blew over the mountains, it lost all its rain. So the tree ring dating is really a far cry from an exact science. There are all kinds of things can happen. I had a guy at the seminar one time years ago. He said, Brother Hovind, I'm a professional wood carver. I carve walking sticks for rich people. They want to pay $500 and I carve a special stick with their name on it or the picture of their wife or something, whatever they want. He said, I've been carving these for, I think he said 50 years. The guy had to be probably 70 years old. He said, I raise my own trees. I plant them myself. I stick the seed in the ground. 7 years later, I cut the tree down. He said, I've got all these I've raised myself. Hundreds of them for walking sticks. I think he said Japanese yew, if I recall. I don't remember what species of tree it was, but he said, I raise them myself. I know exactly how old that tree is. He said, when I cut them down after 7 years, they always have at least 11 rings. I can't answer why, okay? But the rings apparently are seasons, are good times and bad times, not necessarily summer and winter. You get a rainy spring, grows great. Dry summer, has a hard ring. Good fall, another spring ring. So I wouldn't get too excited about tree ring dating as an exact science, but it's an estimate, okay? This textbook says the oldest organism on Earth is 4,300 years old. Earth's oldest organism. Now I had one person say, Hovind, that's a 1977 textbook, and they now found one that's 4,700 years old. Okay, that is possible, okay? Well, let me rephrase that. It's possible that they found one with 4,700 rings. That does not necessarily mean 4,700 years old, okay? If you look at the way these things grow, they're just really ugly, okay? And to count the rings would be a very difficult task. Because sometimes they grow one way and then grow, it's a tangled up, gnarled mess. It's just not a simple thing. Plus you're talking rings where you get about 100 rings per inch. Go count the one in there. You'll see it. Take a look at it for yourself during the break here in a couple minutes. You can see for yourself, this is really tough to count these things. But it's interesting. Why would the oldest living tree be somewhere around 4,300 years old? Well, you see there was a creation 4,400 years ago. Now the oldest tree in the world being 4,300 years old doesn't prove the Bible's right, but it certainly is a good indication. It fits everything else. It doesn't hurt the creation theory. It may hurt the evolution theory. They have an article here. I don't have the date on this. It's from the Washington Post, but if somebody can find the date, please let me know. People send me articles all the time. Oh, you got to see this article. Where did it come from? So I can document it. So they didn't send where it came from, but I don't know where it came from. But the General Sherman tree, the tallest tree in the world, was thought to be 5,000 to 6,000 years old. When they tested it with tree rings, it only had 2,000 rings. So it's pretty tough to estimate.
That's Washington Post. Can you get on the internet?
It's probably from
Find out.
10 or 15 years ago. Yeah, we could probably search it on the internet. Scientists trim 3,000 years off largest tree. Do they say here how tall it is at the time of this?
275 feet,
And 30 feet across? Okay.
33 feet across. Actually, Dr. Hovind, the tallest trees are the coastal redwoods
North of San Francisco?
The coastal.
Well, isn't the General Sherman, it's up there, isn't it?
The Sherman is the largest tree.
Okay, it's a sequoia. Yeah, it's not a redwood. Yeah,
It's the girth and the
yeah. Sequoias are the largest, redwoods are the tallest. Okay.
the largest.
Yeah, they have the most wood in them. There's enough wood in one of those big sequoias to probably build, what, 800 houses or something? It's phenomenal. It's incredible. The bark on those things is 2 feet thick. You know, they have a forest fire come through there and it doesn't even hurt them. You know, it has to really be tough to hurt one of those trees because they're amazingly tough. The largest reef in the world, coral reef, is in Australia. The Great Barrier Reef, it's called, 1,500 miles long. I got a call just south of Brisbane in Beenleigh, and a friend of mine's been a missionary over there for years. He said, hey, Brother Hovind, would you like to come preach in Australia? I said, well, I need to pray about this. He said, yes. That was a no-brainer. So my whole family got to go with me. My kids were probably 16, 17, 18, somewhere around there. We all went over to Australia. My daughter and I actually got to go scuba diving at the Great Barrier Reef. It was incredible. You know, the reef is unbelievable. They say it's the best in the world. That's the first place I went scuba diving, so I assume it's all like that, you know. I've since been to Cozumel, Mexico, which is awful good, and to Hawaii. Now, it's rough, you know, but somebody has to do it over there, so you know, might as well, you know. I've taken the beginner class 3 times, okay? I've never gotten PADI certified or anything. I always have to go through the class, you know, and here's how you do everything. But the Great Barrier Reef was studied pretty intently after World War II. Some of the reef was destroyed by ships and bombs and stuff, and they didn't have time to mess. They got a war to fight, okay? Let's not worry about the environment. We need to have a channel through here. Let's blast a channel through. So they dropped, you know, put dynamite and everything, and they blew up sections of the reef to get it. They can get their ships in and out. Then after the war, okay, now let's see how fast. They watched the reef grow for about 20 years. Kept studying how fast it grows. They found some very interesting things about the reef. The deeper it is below the surface of the water, the slower it grows. Because the coral down there can't quite get enough sunlight. As it gets closer to the surface, it grows faster. Plus, during flood season on land, the reef grows faster. Because more stuff's being washed out. More minerals are in the water, which means more critters can eat the minerals, which means the coral can eat more critters. So during flood season or rainy season, you have a different growth rate than you do during. There are quite a few factors that influence reef growth, okay, how fast it grows. But based on a 20-year average, trying to take everything into consideration, they said the oldest reef in the world is less than 4,200 years old. Some studies said like 3,800 years old, okay? Somewhere around 4,000 years, okay? There's an article in Creation Ex Nihilo magazine, had one, the older version. They're in the library if you guys want to check that out. Creation, they changed the name. It used to be Creation Ex Nihilo, which means creation out of nothing. They changed it, now they just call it Creation Magazine, okay? There's also one called Creation Illustrated, which is good. We encourage people to get either one of them, but they're unrelated to each other. This is an article, I think the book is called Origins, or the magazine is called Origins, and the article is called Coral Reef Growth back in 1979. But that's where they said, look, it's around 4,000 years old. Now keep in mind, this is not one growing organism. It's a whole bunch of organisms growing on top of each other. It's a colony of coral. You know, one dies, leaves its body behind, and the next one grows on top. But why would the oldest or largest reef in the world be less than 4,200 years old? there was a flood 4,400 years ago. Now that flood would have totally rearranged the surface of the earth and reestablished ocean levels, water levels, and reefs would have to start growing from scratch. Though some might have started growing on top of a previous reef if it happened to end up at the right elevation in the water. If a coral reef after the flood, excuse me, if a pre-flood reef ended up 30 feet above sea level, it's all going to die. Okay? If it ends up 300 feet below sea level, it's all going to die. It's got to be a certain distance depending upon the clarity of the water, depending upon the latitude. If it's too cold, it can't live down by Antarctica. You got to figure this world was totally destroyed by this flood. So some of the coral would happen to be at the right elevation, start growing again. There could possibly be some reefs that they find that exhibit even more than 4,300. Here's why. Suppose in the pre-flood world, everything was perfect. And coral could grow like crazy. Let's say it could grow 10 times faster. Pick a number. Then you get this big flood, destroys the world. Now after the flood, that reef happens to end up about the right elevation and it starts growing again. But now its growth rate is much slower. So we take today's growth rate, drill down into that reef, and say, wow, that's 14,000 years old. Based on today's growth rate, yes. But see, the growth rate would have changed because of the oceans changing, the atmosphere changing, so many changes after that flood. Okay, before we start in Niagara Falls, which is the next one, another evidence the Earth is not billions of years old, let's take a couple-minute break, and I want you to go in and take a look at the bristlecone pine and just try to count the rings. You see what I'm talking about, how tight they are. It's pretty cool. All right, back in 5 minutes. All right, let's take up where we left off here. More ways to prove the Earth is not billions of years old. These are called indicators. Geochronometers is another word for it. How old is the Earth? Well, there's no data on it, obviously, but so there's all kinds of ways you can try to kind of test how old it is. The guy, somebody mentioned during the break about calling the pastor, I would recommend you that are taking these class by live or by tape, call all these people. So you can say, I talked to him. It just adds credibility. I talked to the guy that it happened to. And plus, if you find any phone numbers have changed, because I keep notes in here continually, and I keep 7,000 slides all up to date, call me. I'll fix my slide, okay? Try to trace them, or if you can't find them, we'll see if we can, Here's a picture of Niagara Falls. I've preached 3 or 4 times now up in Buffalo, and I always try to go over and see the falls when I get there. It's just incredible. Any of you ever seen Niagara Falls? And well worth going to see. Niagara Falls is huge. This is the Canadian side of it. There's actually two parts to the falls. But the textbook here says, the rocky ledge above Niagara Falls has been eroding for nearly 9,900 years. Now, how could they make a statement like that? How would you know? Well, the water is going over the edge and it breaks the rocks off the edge. All waterfalls do that, okay? Gradually the water breaks off the edge, or the rocks break off the edge, and the water's going to move back. The falls is going to move back. It breaks the rocks off also because underneath the layer of dolostone on top, it's softer underneath. So it erodes the lower part, and then you got this ledge hanging out, all of a sudden it snaps off. You can go up there and buy video footage of some huge chunks of rock breaking off. There were some, I don't know if people were killed or not, but there were some large slabs that broke off one time where it used to be a observation platform. People stand there and watch. All of a sudden, whole thing's gone. An area the size of this room falls off. This this map is from a Niagara Falls museum guide. No, the map is actually from a textbook, I believe. A textbook that I have in my library there. I should get the picture, the date on here. It's one of the geology or earth science textbooks. Anyway, it has been known for several hundred years Niagara Falls is eroding back. That's normal. All waterfalls do that. You can see the lines on there where it used to be in 1764 and then in 1918. It erodes back about 4.7 feet a year, according to the museum guide. Now, in the 1930s, you notice since 1927, it hasn't gone back much. Well, that's because in 1930, they dug a channel beside it to drain the water off to use to make hydroelectric power. They can actually divert all of the water and dry the falls up if they want. They can shut off Niagara Falls. And they do sometimes. If they want to repair it, they shut it off. You can't really shut it off, but they divert the water through this other channel which turns the turbines and makes electricity for who knows how far. Actually, Tesla, the guy that made the Tesla coil we've got right here, was the guy who went to Niagara Falls and built the first generator to generate electricity in America. Nikolai Tesla, the famous Russian genius. I did lots of experiments with Tesla, with electricity. Tesla was in competition with Thomas Edison, and Chuck can tell you all about this stuff. He knows a lot more about that than I do, but Chuck Holcomb. Thomas Edison was just convinced we should use direct current, DC current like your car has, 12-volt DC current. Tesla said, no, we should use alternating current. Well, the advantage of alternating current is you can send it farther. DC current, the farther it goes, the weaker it gets. You got a wire from here to, New Orleans, and there's nothing coming out the other end. Okay, it's too much resistance within the wire. But with alternating current, you can get high voltage and send it further. So obviously, Tesla won out, and we use alternating current everywhere. But the Niagara Falls was eroding back until 1930s when they built this hydroelectric power plant. So now they have greatly decreased the erosion rate. Plus, they have a vested interest, all the stores that own property next to that, all the hotels, they want people to look out the window and see the falls. If they build their $3 million hotel and then the Niagara Falls moves 30 feet, they're going to go build another hotel up there and they're going to get all the business, okay? So there's a vested interest for people to actually do repairs to the falls. They may shut it off for 2 weeks, go out there and, spread some cement to fill in the cracks and keep this erosion from happening again. Bottom line is, until man got involved, it was eroding back 4.7 feet a year. Charles Lyell hated the Bible. He's the guy that strongly influenced Charles Darwin. We'll get into more of that later, but Lyell's a name you got to watch. Charlie Lyell wrote this book, Principles of Geology. He was looking desperately for some way to prove the earth is more than 6,000 years old, because he just wanted to discredit the Bible so badly. He had an ulterior motive, okay? He was a lawyer from Scotland. And he probably had a political reason, because the Bible says to honor the king, and there were people during this time frame who were wanting to get rid of the king, overthrow monarchy. Another long story there, but Charles Lyell went to Niagara Falls in 1841. When he went there, Niagara Falls was here. It obviously started right here where the cliff is. And it's obviously moving back down the gully. It's eating its way backwards, okay? My son-in-law, Paul Jewell, is from the town of Lewiston, which is off here to the left, right under the picture of the book. That's where he was born and raised. His dad pastored at a church up there. I've been there to the Niagara Falls area several times. Down on the lower side, down near Lewiston, they've got quite an interesting park you might want to go see. Today, Niagara Falls is clear back where that yellow arrow is. It is split over that island. Can you see that island in the middle of the river? It has caused there to be two Niagara Falls, the American side and the Canadian side. This is a huge fiberglass map. John, you got to make one of these here one of these days. This is a fiberglass 3D, section of Niagara Falls. It's fascinating. But you can see there in the center of the river, there's an island called Goat Island, and the water splits and goes over both sides. So the one on the upper part is called the American Falls, and the lower part is called the Canadian Falls, because the border goes right down the middle of Goat Island. But from where it started at the edge of the cliff, the falls have moved back 7.5 miles. And you can go up there and study it for yourself. It's about correct, 7.5 miles. Well, there's the two falls there, the American Falls on the left and the Canadian Falls, which is much more pretty, on the right. Most people take the bridge across and go see the Canadian Falls, and they've got spotlights and they light them up and they do all kinds of fancy things with the falls. There have been a couple of times where they've frozen. And pretty cool when you see the Niagara Falls frozen, and that's pretty unusual for that to happen. But the Niagara Falls goes down into this river, this gorge, where the water's just going like crazy through there. They take boat trips up there. They've got a boat with a jet engine on it, and you pay $30 or whatever to get on that thing. And they go up through these rapids, or you can go raft trips down there. This really phenomenal, ice cold water, okay? But this textbook here says, the gorge is about 7.5 miles long, and it runs just below Niagara Falls. That is correct. Then the textbook says, a simple calculation shows it has been 9,900 years. Wait. 7.5 miles, 9,900 years. And that is not correct. If you do the math on it, it's moving back 4.7 feet a year. That's only 8,400 years. Charles Lyell is the one who said it was about 10,000 years old. He made up that number based on a much lower erosion rate because he wanted to discredit the Bible. He's the one who said Niagara Falls is 10,000 years old. And then people said, well, hey, the earth is millions of years old. How can the falls be only 10,000? And he said, well, this proves there was an ice age 10,000 years ago. And the topography of the earth was different, and as the ice melted back, it was ice melt that caused this Niagara Falls to erode this gully. So they date the ice age based on Charles Lyell's estimate that Niagara Falls is 10,000 years old. That's how they come up with that number. Now here's a sketch of Niagara Falls. It's right there. The river is flowing north, okay, into Lake Ontario. Niagara Falls obviously started eroding up here in Lewiston where that cliff is. It's called the escarpment, okay? It is moving back down the gully, the river. If the earth is billions of years old, why hasn't it moved back to Lake Erie by now? Or clear to California, you know? Why is Niagara Falls right there? Well, about 6,000 years ago, God made everything. 4,400 years ago, there was a big flood. A guy named Noah built a big boat, saved all the critters. After the flood was over, the water's running off. Psalm 104 says the mountains arose, the valleys sank down, the water rushed off. Read Psalm 104. And half of that gully washed out the first 20 minutes. You can see after a good rainstorm where the water's running off, it'll eat backwards into the dirt a long ways. You know, the pond we've got out here for drainage, we had to put in a concrete spillway because the water kept eroding the dirt back so fast. One good rainstorm and man, you can lose 15 feet of dirt, you know. So Niagara Falls looks like it's 9,900 years old. They forgot the flood. That's what formed 80% of it. And even then they forgot to get the right number. You used the right mathematics. It should have been 8,400 years, not 9,900 years. But their 9,900 is based on Charles Lyell's estimate, which was a bold-faced lie to try to discredit the Bible. The known erosion rate is 4.7 feet a year. Okay, who cares? When it rains, 30% of the water runs into the ocean. The rest of it evaporates or soaks into the ground, becomes part of the water table. But on average around the world, about 30% is going to run into the ocean. As it runs in, it brings with it what are called mineral salts. There are all kinds of salts in the ground, mineral salts they're called, and they are being washed out into the ocean by the rivers. It's a known fact, nobody argues about it, it's no big deal. Well, today the oceans are 3.6% salt. They're gaining salt every day. They could have gone from nothing to 3.6% in less than 5,000 years. Now, there are all kinds of indicators here that you can look up on creationscience.com or icr.org. They have taken studies of each of the different salts. And they'll say how much of this particular salt, sodium chloride, is in the ocean, and how much comes in every year. And they get a number of maybe 100,000 years. They'll take a different salt, one of the potassium salts, and say, oh, well, this one took, we got 300,000 years worth. So you're going to get different numbers based upon which type of salt you're doing this with and how much is coming into the ocean. Of course, you got to realize, looking at today's salt increase is going to be a really rough estimate. You may have had a whole lot more wash in the first 5 years after the flood was over as the ground is drying out. There may have been a whole lot more salts on the ground for various reasons. But it's a simple fact, most of the salts in the ocean could have accumulated in less than 5,000 years. So, why aren't the oceans saltier? Has anybody ever been to a Great Salt Lake or the Dead Sea in Israel? I was at the Dead Sea over there and they said, don't get any water in your mouth. Well, I took off swimming, I was a lifeguard, and I got one drop of water in my mouth. It is 30% salt. I tasted that for 3 days. I couldn't get that taste of it. It was horrible. I've got some of the Dead Sea water. It's up on Jonathan's desk. It's a Coke bottle full of Dead Sea water. Is it up there, Heath, by your desk? You seen that? You should feel that next to a bottle of regular water. It is just like, golly, it feels like lead. It is so heavy. because it's so saturated in salts. Well, the water is so heavy when you go swimming in it, you float real high. Great Salt Lake in Utah is not quite as salty, but almost. Okay, it's real salty too. Everything washes in. There's no outlet to the Great Salt Lake. Everything evaporates out. There is no spillway. Once in a while they get a bad snow or bad rain and it goes up over the expressway. The interstate has to be shut down around Great Salt Lake till the water evaporates back down. Who cares? Well, I got a postcard. I had a postcard one time years ago when I was a kid. We went out there to Great Salt Lake and went swimming in the Great Salt Lake. And as soon as you dive in, you will discover every scratch on your body. It will start screaming at you. Put salt in a wound and you know what I'm talking about. You know, I forgot I had that scratch right there. You will instantly be reminded of any cuts on your body because of the salt there. But we got this postcard of 4 guys playing cards in the Great Salt Lake. They got a card table that's floating just about that far out of the water. And they're sitting in their chairs. You can see the back of the chair, and the guys are about this, you know, this deep in water, and they're sitting there playing cards. Because the water is so heavy, you float really high. The buoyancy is real high. Well, the Dead Sea is the same way, and the Salton Sea down in Southern California. How far are you from the Salton Sea?
Used to live about 5 hours from it.
Okay, 4 or 5 hours, yeah. Those, to my knowledge, are the 3 saltiest lakes on the earth, okay? They've done studies of the Dead Sea, how much water's coming in, and how much water's evaporating, how quickly is it adding salt. Because evaporation only takes out water, won't take the salt out. And they say it's probably about 11,000 years worth of salt there. Dead Sea, about 11,000. Salt Lake, I don't know if it's ever been tested. That's a good, maybe somebody can find out for me. But the oceans could easily have gathered all that salt in less than 5,000 years. You also have to understand, there are what are called salt plumes. If they dig down into the ground, sometimes they hit like a huge ball of salt. That'll be, you know, the size of Pensacola. I mean, like 15 miles across and thousands of feet thick of pure salt. You've seen those lava lamps, you know, where the stuff, you know, blurbs up in a big ball coming up with a stem hanging down behind it as the lava lamp, as the stuff floats up. That's apparently what the salt did. There were layers of salt in the pre-flood world for who knows what reason. But the salt will start to plume up toward the top, and then it gets trapped and it hardens. There's a place outside of Longview, Texas called Grand Saline. That was famous because in the old days the farmers would go there and get salt for their animals. It was right on the surface. The salt plume broke the surface. Louisiana has dozens of these salt plumes, okay? And sometimes they have to dig down to get to them. We've got right here in the museum somewhere, is it over there, the salt crystals? They're square, huge halite crystals. Somebody sent me some. They're like this, you know, if you ever look at salt under the magnifying glass, it's always little cubes, okay? Well, they sent me some giant cubes from this place in Grand Saline, Texas. I called them, said, hey, we got a museum, you know, can I buy some salt samples? And they said, oh, we'll give them to you. You know, they go down there with semis and load them up, you know, 50 of those a day, semis full of salt with bulldozers as fast as you can pack it. It's just pure salt, you know. The slower it evaporates, the bigger the crystals get. So if something is really deep in the ground and evaporates very slowly, it's got time for the crystals to get really huge and beautiful. That's called accretion, the way crystals grow by a process called accretion, where they add, oh, we do have a petrified clam here. You guys use this for demo purposes?
Yes.
Get a big one from John. Show the kids. Oh, wow, you know, this is tough to see. Petrified clam. I don't see another one.
There should be.
Oh, yeah, you do have a big one. Okay, petrified clam, closed position. You got a really nice one here. Are these some of the ones we just got from that guy?
The one in your right hand is, yes.
Yeah.
I'm sure where we got the other one.
Petrified clam, closed position. Took millions of years, you know, obviously. How did we get off on that? Oh, I saw it. The salt in the ocean. Why aren't the oceans saltier? Well, because they're only 4,400 years old. That's why they're not saltier. Now, what might have happened in the first few hundred years after the flood, there may have been some salt plumes that were exposed in the ocean, at the bottom of the ocean, in which case they're going to dissolve, you know, real quickly. The ones up on land in Longview, Texas, you know, or Grand Saline, Texas, they're a long ways from the beach, you know. The ones in Louisiana are not going to leach into the ocean, but these salt plumes appear all over the world. If there were some near the ocean or in the ocean, they would quickly dissolve, so the salt content of the ocean might have rapidly risen in the first few hundred years after the flood. And today the rate of accumulation would be changed to a much lower number. But I believe at the time of the flood, it was mostly fresh water. And the oceans have gradually become saltier, and today they're 3.6% salt. There's nothing about the salt in the ocean that is harmful to the creation view. I did a debate, an atheist one time, and he said, Hovind, could you please tell me how the freshwater fish survived Noah's flood? Because if you put freshwater fish in salt water, they die. I said, well, sir, aren't you assuming the flood was salt water? He said, the ocean is salt water. I said, well, yeah, it is today. But I think during the flood it's probably fresh water. Atheists would have argued, how could Noah carry enough water on the ark for all the animals? Well, that question assumes that you can't drink the water right outside, doesn't it? What if it's a freshwater flood? Plus, freshwater floats on salt water. The Amazon River, I think the story is at the Amazon. There's a guy, rescue ship went out to pick up this guy. His ship had capsized, and he'd been out there for several days in a raft, you know. And as the ship approached, he's like 100 miles off the coast of South America, I believe, is the way the story went. And he was dying of thirst. 3 days, no water, you know, because you don't want to drink salt water because it makes it worse, makes you saltier, you know. He said, oh, give me a drink. I said, well, dip your head over the side and take a drink. He said, no, it's salt water, I'll die. They said, no, no, it's fresh water. He said, I'm in the ocean, man, it's salt water. He said, no, you're within 100 miles of Brazil. That Amazon River is pushing fresh water out so fast, it floats on top of the salt water, goes out 100 miles. I believe is the number, something close to that. There's fresh water floating on top, way out there. So bend your head over, get a drink. You know, you could have had a drink all this time. But, so I suspect even if there were salt water in the flood, it would tend to sink and fresh water would float on top. So still, Noah could have gotten, or the salt content was less. Today it's 3.6%. And so the oceans have become saltier. Now today we have freshwater crocodiles and saltwater crocodiles. There are freshwater bass and saltwater bass. There are freshwater salmon and saltwater salmon. And the freshwater and saltwater crocodiles probably had a common ancestor. Crocodile. Correct, okay. One guy said, well, that's evolution. I said, no, no, no. Going from a freshwater croc to a saltwater croc is a minor change compared to what you believe. So you believe they changed from a rock to a croc. Now we're talking real major overhaul here, okay? Go from a rock to a croc. I met a guy in Alabama. He said, here he is right here, David Clifton. You can call him up. There's his phone number. In Oak Grove, Alabama, outside of Birmingham. He said, Brother Hovind, I've worked with aquariums all my life. He said, I took black mollies, which is a freshwater fish. There's a picture of one there, black molly. And I slowly added sea salt to their aquarium. After 2 weeks, they became saltwater fish. When I put them back in fresh water, they died in 30 minutes. 2 weeks of gradually adding salt, they adapted to it just fine. I read the story, and I can't document it now. Maybe if one of you here or somebody on tape can document this, that somebody wanted to sail across the ocean in a raft. You took your sailboat across to Hawaii, right? How far? 1,500 miles?
It's 2,800 miles.
2,800 miles in a 30-foot sailboat?
This was a 41-foot sailboat.
41-foot sailboat. How long did it take you?
17 and a half days.
17 and a half days. Airplanes are a lot quicker, you know.
That half day.
Can't forget the half day. Okay. This guy was going to try to sail across the Atlantic, I believe, and he wanted to see, can a human body get adapted to salt water? So he started drinking just a little bit of salt water, diluted down every day. Have you ever heard of stories like this?
I've heard the story, yeah.
What's that? Is it, you know, can you document it, or is it true? Or
Can't document it, but I've heard the story.
that he got to where he could actually drink salt water. And he sailed across the ocean, drinking the salt water along the way.
Small amounts.
Yeah. Your kidneys go nuts at first trying to get rid of all that salt, but after you get used to it, you know. Most of the animals that live in salt water, even though today they require it, sort of, it is a nuisance to them. You can study the different animals and how they have to eliminate the salt from their system. Some turtles, for instance, squirt the salt out of their eyes. They will accumulate the salt in their body, and then they get up, you know, and they squeeze something, some muscle, and the salt squirts out of their eyes. Many of them, sharks, I believe, squirt it out of their urine. They have to get rid of the salt out of their body because they're drinking this stuff all the time, you know, drinking salt water. Anybody know anything else about that? Getting rid of the salt? Different animals have different ways of getting. Even though they live in it, it is a nuisance to them, which may be an indication they were originally designed and lived in fresh water. You know, the original ones in Adam and Eve's time. And today it's a problem. Anyway, how many of you have ever gone into a cave and the guide said, don't touch the formations, they take millions of years to form, right? You go to Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico and they'll say it took 250 million years to form these caverns. I don't think so. They did a study on this back in '78, a couple of scientists did, and they said, this is Dave Madsen, he's a self-professed infidel. He wrote, the Bulletin of National Speleological Society said they gave their observed growth rates as ranging from 0.1 to 10 centimeters per 1,000 years. That means the fastest these things can grow is 2.5 inches in 1,000 years. I beg to differ. Maybe before we get into stalactites more, we should remember fresh water and salt water. There are a lot of animals today that go in and out, like the salmon. Lives in the salt water and then goes upstream, you know, to spawn in the fresh water. There was a whale in California. Do you remember that one that came, Humphrey the humpback whale, I believe it was, came up all the way to Sacramento, got trapped in the river. Sacramento is a long ways upriver. How far would that be? By the way, the river, probably 100 miles in fresh water. And were chasing back out or something. I forget how they did that. You know, had to get the boats and they got stuck. Yeah. Jonathan and I decided, you know, if these dolphin and whales keep beaching themselves, you know, and killing themselves, and the environmentalists go out there and try to drag them back out, you know, we're going to go out there and say, no, don't drag them out. They're trying to evolve, man. Leave them alone, you know. They're trying to grow legs. Leave them here, you know. Stop saving the whales, you know. Okay, back to stalactites. This is a picture under the Lincoln Memorial, a picture taken in the 60s, memorial built in 1922. How do you get 50-inch stalactites in 40 years if they grow 2.5 inches per 1,000 years? Let's see, 50 divided by 2.5 is, what, 20. Did Lincoln die 20,000 years ago? No. This is in Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico. There's a bat covered up with flowstone. Before it had time to rot, it was covered on top. Now this is a stalagmite. Stalactites grow on the ceiling. They hang tight to the ceiling. Stalagmites are on the ground. Stalagmites grow much slower than stalactites because up there you got gravity helping, you know, stretch the minerals out. On the ground, gravity's hurting, you know, squeezing them together. Here's a refrigeration shed down in Fort Pickens, Pensacola, Florida, right down here. You can go out. You've been to Fort Pickens, you know, they got the brick fort, and then next to it is the old steel and concrete fort built for World War I. You have to get special permission to go in there, and because they got it all locked up, because it's unsafe. There's rusty steel sticking out every place, you know, the forts are wrecked. But Brian, that used to work here, went out there with the camera and got this picture, 2 inches long, hanging from a refrigeration shed used in World War I, or after World War I, 1926, the shed was built. Here's a building in Indiana built to be the Lewis and Clark, George Rogers Clark Memorial, built on the Wabash River, Vincennes, Indiana. The building is made out of limestone blocks, and it rains and the water seeps through the limestone. Acid water dissolves limestone. You can take muriatic acid, battery acid, any kind of acid, and pour it on concrete. And it'll start to bubble and foam and fizz. It's dissolving the concrete. When they're done doing a brick building, they build all the brick, you know, they put all the brick up there. Any mortar that's splashed on the brick, they get muriatic acid, which is cheap. You buy it for $2 a gallon, you know, at a swimming pool place. And they get rubber gloves and get a mask on and get a scrub brush and scrub the brick with muriatic acid. It eats away the mortar that is spilled on there. And eats away the mortar between the bricks if you leave it on too long. It'll unbrick your wall for you. Okay? You don't want to do that. But you scrub it on, let it sit for a few minutes and hose it off, and muriatic acid eats it. Well, when plants die, they produce what's called carbonic acid. There are all kinds of acids. I don't know how many, a lot of them. But carbonic acid is a natural product that's in most of the groundwater because of the rotting vegetation. So, as carbonic acid goes through limestone layers, it's going to dissolve a little bit of it. And then when it drips in, like if it soaks through the ground through a layer of limestone, when it finally gets into an opening place on the inside like a cave, as it evaporates, it's going to drop this limestone back off. It's going to redeposit it. It's called flowstone. So it started off as limestone. It's now been dissolved chemically and redeposited as flowstone. And that's what causes these features right here, stalactites, stalagmites, and flowstone. Well, this building was 40 years old when the picture was taken. And they're huge. Looks like a cave that some guide is going to say, oh, this took 200 million years to form. No, sir, it took 40 years. Okay. Here's a cave, or a mine, I'm sorry, a lead mine in Australia, Queensland, Australia. The mine was closed down for 55 years. Seal the door off, close it down. It's unsafe or not enough lead to get, who knows why. They closed it down for whatever reason, okay? Either unsafe or not commercially worth going after. The cost of extraction is greater than the value you receive. Well, after 55 years, they said, well, let's go see how it's doing inside. They opened the door, went in there, and it was looked like a natural cave, stalactites all over the place, stalagmites on the floor, and all this formed in 55 years. There are two people inside that circle. You can get an idea how big this stuff is in 55 years. There's a Oasis Cafe at Herbert Field down here in Navarre, just 30 miles from here. It was built in 1993. 7 years later, in the year 2000, it had a 13-inch stalactite growing off of a drippy pipe. Pipe had been dripping water. This is not a piece of that one, but it's just like it, okay? They gave me the 13-inch stalactite, part of it, but it looked like this. And on the ground, as it dripped on the ground, it was leaving behind, building a stalagmite, which they gave me, and it's right here. 7 years. Now, those guys did a study and said the fastest they can grow is 2.5 inches per 1,000 years. I'm sorry, I disagree. I think they're wrong, all right?
For more information on other materials offered by Creation Science Evangelism, call us at 850-479-DINO. That's 850-479-3466. Or visit us online at www.drdino.com. That's www.drdino.com.